On August 22, 1942, 929 Soviet officers arrived at the Stalingrad Front after being stripped of their ranks, their medals confiscated, and their names added to a newly created military formation called a Shtrafbat, a Battalion, a penal battalion. They had been convicted under Order Number 227, issued 3 weeks earlier by Joseph Stalin, of demonstrating cowardice or bewilderment during combat, failures that in Stalin's judgment warranted demotion to the lowest enlisted rank and assignment to the most dangerous sectors of the front. 3 days later, after continuous assaults against German positions, only 300 remained alive. The other 629 were dead or wounded, so severely they could no longer fight. This represented the inaugural deployment of the systematized Shtrafbat system, a framework that would process 422,700 Soviet soldiers through penal units between September 1942 and May 1945. Very few of them survived the war. The system operated on a principle Stalin made explicit in Order 227. Soldiers guilty of crimes against the motherland would be given an opportunity to redeem by blood their offences, a phrase that wasn't metaphorical but literal. Blood, preferably the offender's own, spilled in combat against German forces, would cleanse the stain of cowardice or desertion or whatever other failure had warranted punishment. This is the story of the Shtrafbats, the men sentenced to them, the missions they were assigned, the redemption they sought through wounds and death, the commanders who used them ruthlessly or mercifully, depending on personal inclination, and how a system designed to restore military discipline became one of the Eastern Front's most brutal mechanisms for converting disgrace into sacrifice. The context for order. 227 was catastrophic military defeat when Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. The Wehrmacht destroyed virtually the entire pre-war Red Army within 6 months. For every German soldier killed in 1941, 20 Soviet soldiers died. The casualty ratio reflected not just German military superiority, but Soviet organizational chaos, with units disintegrating under German assault, commanders losing control of their forces, and soldiers retreating in panic or surrendering in masses that suggested systemic collapse rather than tactical withdrawal. By mid-1942, things had gotten worse rather than better. German forces occupied most of the European portion of the Soviet Union and were pushing towards Stalingrad, approximately 1,000 miles inside Soviet territory from the western border. The Red Army was suffering defeats that suggested the Soviet state might not survive. Stalin needed measures dramatic enough to halt the retreat, restore discipline, and convince his armies that death fighting was preferable to death retreating or capture. On July 28, 1942, Stalin issued Order Number 227 as People's Commissar of Defense. The order wasn't published in newspapers, but was read aloud to every man and woman in the Soviet armed forces, ensuring that everyone understood what was now required. The order's most famous phrase, "Not one step back, ni shagu nazad," became the slogan of Soviet propaganda during summer and fall 1942, though the order itself contained much more than slogans. The order established specific requirements. Each front, the Soviet equivalent of army groups, must create between 1 and 3 penal battalions of up to 800 men each, consisting of middle-ranking commanders and high-ranking commanders, guilty of breaches of discipline due to cowardice or bewilderment. Each army must create between 5 and 10 penal companies of 150 to 200 men each, consisting of ordinary soldiers and junior commanders guilty of similar offences. These units would be sent to the most difficult sectors of the front to give them an opportunity to redeem by blood their crimes against the motherland. The order also established blocking detachments, Заградitelные отряды, barrier troops positioned behind frontline units with orders to shoot panic mongers and cowards attempting unauthorized retreat. These detachments, drawn from NK-FID personnel and later from SMERSH, the Soviet counterintelligence organization whose name derived from Smrt Spionem, or death to spies, would ensure that soldiers faced a simple choice: advance against German forces or be shot by Soviet forces behind them. The math of order. 227 was deliberately harsh. Officers who permitted unauthorized retreat would be arrested and treated as traitors. Rank-and-file soldiers demonstrating cowardice would be shot on the spot, or, if circumstances permitted formal processing, assigned to Shtrafbats where they could demonstrate courage they had previously lacked. The threat of summary execution or penal battalion assignment was designed not primarily to punish offenders, but to deter waverers, to reassure determined soldiers that anyone breaking discipline would face consequences harsh enough to make fighting seem the safer option. By November 26, 1942, Georgy Zhukov, then Deputy Commander-in-Chief, issued the formal standardization order titled Status of Penal Units of the Army. This directive established specific organizational structures. Penal battalions would consist of 360 men, commanded by mid-range and senior Red Army officers and political officers, polytruks, who had not themselves been sentenced to penal service. Penal companies would consist of 100 to 150 men, commanded by sergeants and NCOs, also from regular forces rather than from the convicted population. The command structure was deliberate and important. A penal battalion would be commanded by a colonel with 2 deputies, a chief of staff, and a political officer. Companies would be commanded by majors, platoons by captains. These command positions were held by regular Red Army officers whose service in Shtrafbat command earned special benefits. 1 month of service counted as 6 months toward promotion and pension. The pay was substantially higher than regular officer positions. Compensation for the unpleasant and sometimes dangerous work of commanding men who had been stripped of rank and were being used as expendable assault troops. The permanent staff, including commanders, headquarters personnel, medical instructors, signalmen, and clerks, were supplemented by armed guard companies that maintained discipline when units were out of the line. Behind these guard companies stood NKVD, or SMERSH detachments ready to shoot anyone attempting to flee. The system created multiple layers of enforcement, ensuring that Shtrafniki, as the sentenced soldiers were called, had essentially no option except to fight forward until they were wounded, killed, or had served their sentence. The categories of men subject to Shtrafbat service were diverse but shared common threads of perceived failure or disloyalty. Those convicted of desertion or cowardice under Order 227 formed the largest category. Cowardice in the immediate face of enemy fire was sometimes punished with instant execution, but soldiers or officers in rear areas suspected of having a reluctance to fight could be summarily stripped of rank and reassigned to a Shtrafbat without formal trial beyond a drumhead court-martial that rarely took more than minutes. Former Soviet prisoners of war who had been liberated by advancing Red Army forces found themselves immediately suspect. Stalin had made clear that surrender or falling into enemy captivity, even if wounded, was tantamount to cowardice and possibly treason. Escaped POWs were routinely sent to penal units under retroactive application of Order 227, the logic being that real Soviet soldiers should have died fighting rather than allow themselves to be captured. This policy created the perverse incentive structure where soldiers wounded and captured through no fault of their own faced punishment if they survived and returned to Soviet lines. Gulag labor camp inmates represented another significant source of Shtrafbat personnel. Physically capable prisoners could volunteer for military service and many were drafted directly from the camps. This included what Soviet records euphemistically called the usual Stalinist mix: civilians imprisoned for political unreliability, bureaucrats accused of sabotage, military personnel convicted of various offences, common criminals, and political dissidents. For Gulag inmates, Shtrafbat service represented a possible path to freedom, though in practice the survival rate suggested it was simply trading slow death by starvation and exposure for fast death by bullets. The range of offences that could result in Shtrafbat assignment was remarkably broad and often arbitrary. Neglect of military equipment, sabotage, drunkenness, reluctance to fight, unauthorized retreat, failure to advance when ordered, losing contact with higher command, allowing German forces to break through defensive positions, even accidentally killing a fellow soldier through negligent weapon handling, all these could result in court-martial and penal battalion sentence. The system's arbitrariness meant that genuinely cowardly soldiers served alongside officers who had made tactical errors, alongside former POWs who had escaped captivity, alongside political prisoners who had committed no military offence at all. The term of service in infantry penal battalions ranged from 1 month to 3 months, with the maximum term usually applied to those who would otherwise have qualified for death penalty. Standard conversion rates existed for translating imprisonment sentences into penal battalion terms, suggesting that the system, despite its brutality, operated with bureaucratic regularity. Those sentenced to 3 months typically understood this meant they had been deemed deserving of execution, but were being given a final chance to demonstrate value to the Soviet state through expendable assault missions. Penal battalion service in infantry roles was viewed by most Soviet prisoners as tantamount to a death sentence, and the statistics bear out this perception. The missions assigned to Shtrafbats were explicitly the most dangerous available: frontal assaults on prepared German defensive positions, attacks across open ground without adequate fire support, clearing minefields by walking through them in human waves, reconnaissance missions into heavily defended areas, holding exposed positions that regular units would refuse to occupy. The underlying logic was simple. Strafniki were expendable in ways that regular soldiers were not, and their expenditure in high-casualty missions potentially saved regular forces from equivalent losses. Mine clearing became particularly associated with Shtrafbats, though whether this represented systematic policy or battlefield improvisation remains debated among historians. Soviet engineer units specialized in mine detection and removal were chronically understaffed and overworked on the Eastern Front, where German forces had time to extensively mine defensive positions during their long retreat from Stalingrad onward. When engineer support was unavailable and time pressure required rapid advance, sending Shtrafbats across suspected minefields provided quick, if horrifically costly, mine detection. Survivors would mark safe lanes through fields. Those killed by mines served the same function through their deaths, showing where mines remained active. The physical experience of Shtrafbat service was grinding and terrifying. Soldiers stripped of rank wore no insignia distinguishing them as penal troops, but everyone knew what Strafniki were and treated them accordingly. Regular Red Army soldiers viewed them with mixture of contempt and pity: contempt for whatever failure had led to their assignment, pity for the near certainty they wouldn't survive. Strafniki received minimal equipment, often entering combat with inadequate weapons, no body armour beyond what they could scavenge, and ammunition supplies that suggested their commanders viewed resupply as wasteful, given expected casualty rates. Before assaults, Strafbats would be positioned at the front of attack formations, regular Red Army units behind them, blocking detachments behind those regular units. The arrangement created pressure from multiple directions: German fire from ahead, pressure to advance from regular units behind who needed the Strafniki to absorb initial defensive fire, and identify German strongpoints through the process of being killed attacking them, and SMERSH, or NKVD, blocking troops further back, ready to shoot anyone attempting unauthorized withdrawal. The physical sensation of waiting for assault orders was distinctively terrible for Shtrafniki, in ways that regular soldiers didn't fully experience. Regular soldiers knew they faced death, but believed they had some agency in whether they lived or died, that their training and skill and luck might save them. Shtrafniki understood that their survival was essentially random, that they would be sent forward regardless of tactical situation, that the mission's objective was often simply to draw German fire and locate defensive positions through the process of attacking them, and that individual courage or skill meant less than whether German machine gunners happened to kill the man next to you instead of you. The moments before attack represented peak psychological terror. Shtrafniki would crouch in their assembly positions, checking weapons they knew were inadequate, adjusting equipment that barely functioned, watching officers check watches and coordinate timing with regular forces behind them. Everyone understood what would happen. They would rise and charge toward German positions across open ground or through destroyed buildings. German defenders would open fire with machine guns and mortars and artillery. Men would begin falling. Wounded soldiers would scream for medics who might not come. Dead soldiers would collapse into positions that had to be climbed over, and those who reached German lines would fight desperately because there was nowhere else to go. The noise during assaults was overwhelming and disorienting. German MG-42 machine guns fired at approximately 1,200 rounds per minute, creating continuous tearing sounds that drowned out individual shots. Artillery shells produced concussive blasts that knocked men down and left them temporarily deafened. Mortars created sharp cracking explosions that threw dirt and shrapnel in all directions. Through this noise, Shtrafniki had to hear and obey orders from commanders, coordinate with soldiers around them, and maintain some sense of tactical situation despite chaos that reduced combat to immediate survival instincts. The smell of Shtrafbat assaults mixed cordite from weapons fire with blood from wounds, with smoke from explosions, with dirt thrown up by impacts, with the distinct sweet rot smell of bodies that had lain on battlefields for days or weeks before the current assault crossed them. Men vomited from fear or from concussive effects of near-miss artillery. Bladders and bowels released involuntarily when men were hit or when fear became too intense. The physical experience of terror produced its own smells that mixed with combat's mechanical odours into something Shtrafniki would remember for the rest of their lives if they survived. The visual experience was equally distinctive. Shtrafniki advancing toward German positions would see men ahead of them suddenly collapse, hit by fire from weapons they couldn't locate. Bodies would jerk and spin when bullets hit them, falling in patterns that became horribly familiar to survivors, who learned to distinguish immediately fatal hits from wounds that allowed soldiers to crawl or stumble toward cover. German defensive positions often remained invisible until muzzle flashes revealed them, and by then the revelation came too late to avoid the fire. The ground was torn up by shell impacts, creating craters and debris fields that had to be navigated while being shot at. The assault pattern was brutally straightforward. Shtrafniki would advance at a run toward German positions, attempting to close distance before defensive fire killed too many of them. Those who reached German lines would fight at close quarters, using grenades, bayonets, whatever weapons remained functional, attempting to create breaches through which regular forces could exploit. Those killed in the assault would be left where they fell. Those wounded would receive medical attention only after the position was taken, if medical personnel had time and supplies to treat them, which often they didn't. One Shtrafnik officer later wrote, "To describe everything I had to survive is not possible. You would have to be there. It's enough to say that by the age of 23, I have grown grey." This officer had served 1 year and 7 months in penal battalions, an extraordinary survival duration given typical casualty rates. During that time, he had been promoted from stripped rank back to captain and then major, demonstrating that the system, despite its brutality, did offer genuine redemption for those who survived long enough to earn it. The redemption mechanism was explicit and formal. Shtrafniki convicted to infantry units were eligible for commutation of sentence and return to Red Army regular units if they suffered a combat injury, meaning the crime was considered cleansed in blood. The phrase wasn't metaphorical. Actual blood, flowing from an actual wound received in actual combat, provided the necessary redemption. The severity of the wound mattered less than its combat origin. A minor shrapnel injury earned during assault qualified for redemption, while serious wounds from accidents did not. Alternatively, Shtrafniki could earn redemption through extremely heroic deeds in combat, actions sufficiently courageous to outweigh whatever failure had led to their penal assignment. Such heroism usually involved actions that regular soldiers would consider suicidal: charging German machine gun nests alone, covering enemy firing positions with one's body to allow unit advance, holding impossible positions against overwhelming force, sacrificing oneself to accomplish mission objectives. That such heroism often resulted in death presented no problem for the system. Posthumous awards and restoration of honour served propaganda purposes while also motivating living Shtrafniki to similar sacrifices. Lieutenant Vladimir Yermak's story illustrates the redemption through sacrifice pattern with particular clarity. Yermak, 19 years old, ended up in a penal unit for criminal negligence. He had accidentally pulled the trigger while cleaning a loaded weapon, killing a passing soldier. This wasn't cowardice or desertion, but simple carelessness elevated to criminal offence deserving penal battalion sentence. 10 days after assignment to the 14th Separate Assault Battalion, on July 19, 1943, during a reconnaissance-in-force operation at Leningrad, Yermak rushed a German bunker and covered the machine gun with his body, allowing his unit to advance past the position without taking casualties from its fire. Major Lisik, the battalion commander, posthumously awarded Yermak the Order of the Red Banner and immediately recommended him for Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest Soviet military decoration. The recommendation was approved in February 1944. Yermak's transformation from criminally negligent soldier who killed a comrade through carelessness to Hero of the Soviet Union who killed himself through deliberate sacrifice took exactly 10 days. The system had worked as designed. A disgraced soldier had redeemed his honour through blood, specifically his own blood, spilled in circumstances that served Soviet military objectives. The 65th Penal Company's experience in December 1943 demonstrates both the system's brutality and its occasional mercy. On December 14th, the company, together with a training battalion from the 72nd Guards Rifle Division, attacked the German-occupied village of Sotninsky Khutor in central Ukraine. Encountering fierce defensive fire, they were forced to retreat, but in the process, 15 Shtrafniki became separated from Soviet lines and encircled by German forces. For 3 days, these 15 men held off German attempts to eliminate them, surviving without resupply and with dwindling ammunition until December 18th, when another Soviet offensive relieved them. The aftermath showed how commanders exercised discretion within the system's formal rules. Approximately 30 members of the 65th Penal Company were transferred back to regular units following the battle, including presumably the 15 who had held out, but also others who had fought bravely during the failed assault. 5 of those killed received posthumous orders of the Patriotic War, first and second class, demonstrating that death in combat earned recognition even for Shtrafniki. The commander evidently decided that soldiers who fought that desperately deserved redemption, whether technically wounded or not. The 614th Penal Company's assault on Mustatunturi Ridge in October 1944 illustrates the extreme casualty rates Shtrafbats could suffer when assigned to particularly impossible missions. The ridge, located in Soviet Arctic near the Barents Sea, was heavily fortified by German forces who had months to prepare defensive positions. On October 10th, Soviet command launched a large-scale offensive against these fortifications. The 614th, 750 men strong, comparable in size to a regular battalion, attacked from the sea, attempting to divert German attention from the main Soviet assault by climbing the sheer wall of the ridge under heavy machine gun fire while cutting through extensive barbed wire barriers. Approximately 70% of the company's personnel perished during this assault, meaning roughly 525 men killed or mortally wounded in a single attack. Among them, 3 soldiers followed Lieutenant Yermak's example from the previous year, covering German machine guns with their bodies to silence the positions. One was Sergeant Alexander Danilchenko, commander of the company's machine gun platoon, who sacrificed himself to allow his men to advance. Whether these sacrifices were voluntary or the result of wounds that left soldiers unable to continue, but capable of final gestures, remains unknowable, but the system classified them as heroic and awarded decorations accordingly. In addition to infantry Shtrafbats, which represented the majority of penal units, the system included Air Force penal squadrons, sometimes designated Corrective Aviation Squadrons, Korrektirovochная авиационная эскадрилья. Pilots or gunners assigned to these squadrons faced a particularly cruel variant of the redemption system. Because air combat injuries were usually fatal, pilots had minimal opportunity to earn redemption through wounds. They received no credit for missions flown, only for being wounded or killed, meaning effectively they were kept in service until they died in action. Former Soviet Air Force pilot Artyom Afinogenov recalled Air Force penal squadrons near Stalingrad. Penal squadron pilots were sent to the most dangerous places, first of all to Volga bridge crossings where the future of Stalingrad was decided, to airfields and enemy tank concentrations. So it was only penal squadrons that were sent to attack these targets, yet these operational flights were not taken into consideration. The phrase "not taken into consideration" captures the system's cruelty. Pilots could fly dozens of dangerous missions successfully without earning redemption, because redemption required wounds or death, and aerial combat provided few opportunities for the former without guaranteeing the latter. The death rate among gunners serving in penal air squadrons was exceptionally high, even by Shtrafbat standards. While infantry Strafniki could theoretically survive 10 major assaults and earn commutation through accumulated service, air gunners had no equivalent metric. They simply flew missions until they were shot down, at which point their sentence ended through death rather than redemption. This created situations where skilled pilots and gunners, sentenced to penal squadrons for offences ranging from real cowardice to bureaucratic scapegoating, were systematically killed in missions that regular Air Force personnel would have refused as suicidal. Commander attitudes toward releasing Strafniki back to regular units varied dramatically, depending on personal inclination and interpretation of regulations. General Alexander Gorbatov, who himself had survived imprisonment and understood the arbitrary nature of Stalin's purges, released all Strafniki who had fought bravely in battle regardless of whether they were wounded. This merciful interpretation recognized that courage in combat demonstrated redemption regardless of whether blood was literally spilled, and that soldiers who fought desperately against German forces had proven their loyalty to the Soviet state regardless of whatever earlier failure had led to their sentences. In contrast, General Pavel Batov, commander of the 65th Army, only rehabilitated Strafniki who were killed or wounded in action, using the remaining Strafniki continuously until either they earned redemption through blood or the war ended. This harsh interpretation followed the letter of Order 227, which specified redemption through blood and reflected a commander's calculation that Shtrafniki existed to absorb casualties that would otherwise fall on regular forces. Using them until they were expended, either through death or wounds, maximised their military utility while minimising losses among soldiers who hadn't earned punishment. The blocking detachments, Zagrado-Triade, played essential roles in the Shtrafbat system, though their actual function was more nuanced than popular myth suggests. In the first 3 months after Order 227 was issued, blocking detachments shot approximately 1,000 penal troops and sent 24,000 more to penal battalions, numbers that suggest most soldiers attempting unauthorized retreat were arrested rather than immediately executed, according to internal NKVD records from October 1942. On the Stalingrad Front between August 1st and October 15th, restricted forces picked up 15,649 soldiers who fled the front line. Of these, 244 were imprisoned, 278 were shot, 218 were sent to penal companies, 42 to penal battalions, and 14,833 were returned to their units. These numbers indicate that blocking detachments functioned primarily as military police rather than execution squads, with most soldiers who attempted retreat being returned to their units rather than shot or imprisoned. However, the threat of immediate execution was real enough to serve its deterrent purpose. The knowledge that Smersh detachments stood behind frontline units with machine guns ready ensured that soldiers facing German assault calculated they had better odds advancing than retreating. By October 1942, the idea of regular blocking detachments was quietly dropped by most commanders, who viewed diverting troops to create blocking formations as wasteful when those troops could be used for actual combat. On October 29, 1944, blocking detachments were officially disbanded by Stalin's Order number 349, citing changed situation at the front. The total number of people convicted to penal units from September 1942 to May 1945 was 422,700, representing approximately 1.5% of the total 34.5 million men and women who served in the Soviet armed forces during the war. Very few of these 422,700 survived the war. The most commonly cited estimates suggest that approximately half, around 211,000 to 215,000, were killed or fatally wounded during their Shtrafbat service. Latest Russian estimates put the total number of Soviet soldiers killed by other Soviet soldiers in blocking detachments at 158,000, including as many as 15,000 shot over a couple of weeks in Stalingrad during fall 1942. These statistics require contextual understanding. The Eastern Front was catastrophically lethal for all Soviet soldiers, with overall Red Army casualty rates far exceeding those of any other combatant force in World War II. Shtrafniki died at higher rates than regular soldiers, but the differential wasn't as extreme as popular mythology suggests. Many Shtrafbats fought alongside regular units rather than exclusively on suicide missions, and commanders who valued combat effectiveness used their Shtrafniki as assault troops rather than simply as expendable mine detectors. The system was brutal and often arbitrary, but it wasn't purely exterminatory. Genuine opportunities for redemption existed for those who survived long enough to earn them. The post-war fate of redeemed Shtrafniki varied considerably depending on the nature of their original offences. Soldiers convicted of military failures like unauthorized retreat or losing contact with higher command could, if they earned redemption through wounds or heroism, return to regular military service and eventually civilian life without lasting stigma beyond their own memories. However, those sentenced to Shtrafbats for political unreliability or ideological deviation, even if they earned formal redemption and restoration of honour, remained marked men who continued to face persecution after the war ended. The Soviet system maintained detailed records of everyone who had served in penal units, and these records were accessible to secret police, Communist Party officials, and state security organizations throughout the post-war period. Former Shtrafniki found themselves denied employment in sensitive positions, rejected for Communist Party membership, investigated repeatedly for possible continuing disloyalty, and generally treated with suspicion, despite having literally shed blood to prove their loyalty. The stain of penal battalion service, even after formal redemption, persisted in ways that made many veterans regret surviving long enough to experience post-war Soviet society. The practical consequences of Shtrafbat records were extensive and enduring. Former penal troops who attempted to enter universities found their applications rejected when background checks revealed their service history. Those who sought employment in government ministries, defense industries, or any position requiring security clearance encountered systematic discrimination that prevented career advancement. The KGB maintained active surveillance on many former Shtrafniki, periodically summoning them for interrogation about their current activities and political reliability, ensuring they never forgot that the state remembered their earlier disgrace despite formal redemption. Family members of former Shtrafniki also faced consequences. Children found their educational opportunities limited when forms requested information about parents' military service. Wives discovered that their husbands' penal battalion records affected their own employment prospects and social standing. The contamination spread through family networks in ways that punished not just the former Shtrafniki, but everyone associated with them, reinforcing the message that dishonor, once incurred, could never be completely erased, regardless of redemption earned through blood. The psychological aftermath for survivors was particularly devastating because it combined combat trauma with the specific terrors of Shtrafbat service. Regular combat veterans could process their experiences within frameworks of honor, duty, and contribution to victory. Shtrafniki survivors had to integrate memories of being used as expendable assault troops, of watching comrades die in missions designed to waste their lives, of knowing that their survival was random rather than earned, and of understanding that the state that demanded their sacrifice continued to view them with suspicion after victory was won. Many former Shtrafniki experienced what would later be recognized as symptoms of severe post-traumatic stress. Nightmares featuring assaults where everyone around them died, hypervigilance that made civilian life feel constantly dangerous, emotional numbness that prevented normal relationships, survivors' guilt about comrades who died while they lived, and recurring questions about why they survived when so many others didn't. These psychological wounds received no official recognition or treatment in post-war Soviet society, which had no framework for acknowledging that soldiers might be damaged by their service rather than ennobled by it. The social isolation of Shtrafbat veterans was particularly acute. They couldn't discuss their service with regular combat veterans without encountering contempt or pity, couldn't explain to civilians what Shtrafbat service had been like, couldn't seek help from state institutions that viewed them with ongoing suspicion, and often couldn't maintain intimate relationships with family members who couldn't understand experiences that defied normal comprehension. Many withdrew into alcohol or silence, living out their remaining years in isolation that was simultaneously chosen and imposed by a society that wanted them forgotten. Lieutenant Belayev, who served in penal units for a year and 7 months, later wrote that he grew grey by age 23 from the experience. He was promoted to captain and then major during his service, demonstrating successful navigation of the redemption system, but the psychological cost of that survival was evident in his memoir. He described experiences that were impossible to fully communicate to those who hadn't lived through them, suggesting that Shtrafbat service created traumatic isolation even among combat veterans, a special category of suffering that separated penal troops from regular soldiers who had fought the same war but under different conditions. The Shtrafbat system existed from July 25, 1942, when the first penal company was formed 3 days before Order 227 was issued, until June 6, 1945, when the last penal company was disbanded. On July 18, 1945, soldiers still serving in penal units were amnestied under decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet about amnesty in connection with the victory over Nazi Germany. This decree recognized that whatever offences had warranted Shtrafbat sentences were no longer relevant after Germany's complete defeat, and that soldiers who had survived penal service through nearly 3 years of desperate combat had more than adequately demonstrated their loyalty to the Soviet state. The legacy of the Shtrafbat system remains controversial in Russia and former Soviet states. During the Soviet period, the system was rarely discussed publicly, as it didn't fit neatly into propaganda narratives emphasizing Soviet heroism and self-sacrifice. Post-Soviet historians have debated whether the system was militarily effective, morally justifiable, or simply another manifestation of Stalinist brutality applied to military context. Defenders argue that Order 227 and the Shtrafbat system restored discipline at a desperate moment, potentially preventing Soviet defeat. Critics argue that the system wasted military talent, terrorized soldiers who would have fought effectively without threatening them with penal battalions, and exemplified Stalinist disregard for human life. What remains undebatable is that 422,700 Soviet soldiers passed through the Shtrafbat system, that approximately half of them died during their service, and that survivors carried physical and psychological scars that marked them for life. The phrase "redeemed by blood" captured the system's essential logic. Soldiers whose failures had dishonored the Soviet state could restore that honor through their own blood, preferably spilled while killing Germans, but acceptable regardless of military outcome as long as the sacrifice was genuine and the blood was real. On August 22, 1942, 929 Soviet officers, stripped of rank and honor, were sent to the Stalingrad Front as the first Shtrafbat deployed under Order 227's systematized framework. 3 days later, only 300 remained. The other 629 had paid their debt in blood, some earning redemption through wounds they survived, others earning posthumous restoration of honor through deaths in combat. The system that consumed them would continue for nearly 3 more years, processing hundreds of thousands of soldiers through penal battalions and companies, offering them the choice between dying with disgrace or dying with honor, and in most cases ensuring they died regardless of which they chose. Offering them the choice between dying with disgrace or dying with honor, and in most cases ensuring they died regardless of which they chose.